they are is the 3 Canadian officers from the General Staff driving around New York State, taking photographs of vital points. And when you take a look at the photographs here, the covered bridge 3 miles east of Williston looking up the Winooski River from the left bank, well, it's the Burlington, Vermont area on that old invasion route to Montreal. Where there are rivers, there are bridges. Where there are bridges, if you blow the bridge, the Americans are going to have, it's going to take time for them to come back. It's still a primitive transportation culture by comparison with today. So the chances of actually slowing down a possible American counterattack were actually quite reasonably good.
So the stage was set for the first 6 months of the war. America would mobilize a huge army to launch 4 offensives into Canada before the British could arrive in force, while the Canadians staged lightning raids into the States to slow down American preparations and buy the British more time. Which strategy would have been successful? Could the British arrive in time to save Canada? Unfortunately, the Canadians were in for a nasty surprise.
The British never, for a second, seriously thought about the possibility of mobilizing troops and sending them to Canada in order to try to withstand an American invasion. The assumption was that Canada itself would eventually be overrun and conquered, that Canadian trade would be lost. You know, that was inevitable.
Yeah, I mean, I think logistically what you're looking at is a misconception entirely about what kind of war would have taken place in North America. I mean, the idea that Britain would raise an army that large and then project it across the Atlantic into Canada just doesn't fit with British thinking at all.
So whereas the Americans are thinking in terms of we conquer Canada and the war will pretty much quickly come to an end, the British are thinking that's just where things are going to get started.
Since the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, Britain had been the greatest naval power on Earth. Her instinct was to fight wars at sea rather than on land, and that would dictate how she would respond to the American attacks.
What you would want to do would be able to hold on to Halifax, eastern seaboard, and then also maybe perhaps be able to hold on to one in the south and Bermuda to be able to interdict any of the trade and commerce that comes off the eastern coast of the United States. And if push came to shove, the Royal Navy would start to attack Boston, New York, Charleston, and eradicate American shipping on the high seas. Now that's a war that nobody would want.
Even if the bulk of Canada was overrun, the British could still conduct a naval campaign from their ports in Halifax and the Caribbean. So who would prevail in the battle on the high sea? The American planners knew the naval battles would be critical, so they put a lot of energy into working through such an engagement. The records of their war games give us a blow-by-blow account of how they saw such a naval battle unfolding.
So, John, shall we look at the Great Battle of the Atlantic as preserved in our illustrious archives?
The British fleet is being assembled in European waters at the beginning of the campaign to move across the Atlantic, and this is considered move one.
Right.
There's something of the game of blind man's bluff here as both fleets are trying to locate each other.
This must be the British battle fleet. And here are the battle cruisers.
Moving into action. Okay, here's the blue main body, red main body. They're closing rapidly.
Yeah, indeed.
Around move 24. And as you can see, there's a lot of action going on.
Wow. It's happening.
There's a collision's going to happen.
Now they pulled up here in an attempt to
make the engagement be that the two fleets are going to parallel and fight each other with their main batteries firing at each other.
Highly exciting. Oh, here,
and here it is.
Ladies and gentlemen, is the outcome.
Here we see some submarines sunk, destroyers sunk, but look at the damage here.
Yeah.
Torpedo hits, 500-pound bomb direct hits.
Oh, this is very much like Jutland, though, because there's simply damages. There are no battleships sunk.
this isn't decisive. These losses are heavy, but they're not decisive.
The conclusion of the war game was that the two navies were evenly matched. It would have been virtually impossible for either to achieve outright victory, which suited the British just fine.
British hope was that this would be enough, that you can't protect Canada, but if you can make things difficult for the Americans and cause them enough sort of economic dislocation and just inconvenience, that eventually the Americans are just going to get tired of it and say, okay, we've hit a stalemate, there's a deadlock here, we don't have anything left to gain, we've got Canada, now's the time to bargain and to negotiate some sort of a settlement.
In the end, the war would have cost thousands of lives, caused devastation in Canada and all along the American border. But at sea, the British Navy could have held the Americans at bay. Canada would have been lost, but the British Empire and her trade elsewhere would be intact. But if there really was so much ill feeling between the two countries in the 1930s, how did we end up as such close allies just a few years later? In the next part, we will find out. When American journalist Peter Carlson discovered a copy of War Plan Red buried in the American National Archive, he had a blueprint for war between Britain and America. We have now war-gamed these plans to see what the outcome would have been. If war had broken out, Canada would have been quickly overrun by the Americans, but the British Navy could have contained the threat at sea, eventually leading to a negotiated settlement. However, despite the enthusiasm within the American military for Plan Red, as the 1930s progressed, the plans were becoming ever more detached from political reality.
That war didn't occur between Britain and the United States is due in part to the statecraft of the leaders of the time. The First World War was a horror that no one wanted to go through again.
Hundreds of thousands of their brothers and friends had been killed. There was nothing beautiful to them about war, and they had no desire for another.
Leaders of the interwar period had a crystal ball in front of them that the leaders before 1914 didn't have. They could see the consequences, the horror of what war would entail. The high cost, the loss of life, the disruption of the international economy. They could see that they didn't want to have another war like that again. And so leaders on both sides of the Atlantic were committed to never again.
Britain in particular was sick of war. While the American military prepared for the worst-case scenario in Plan Red, they failed to understand that Britain would do pretty much anything to avoid conflict with the United States, even at the expense of her national interests.
1937-38, it was a new trade agreement between Britain and the United States. Now, the negotiations were pretty fraught, and essentially the British didn't think that economically they were getting a good deal. Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister, basically said, well, we're not doing this for the trade benefits. We're doing this to try to entangle ourselves with the United States more, to try to improve the general relationship, and it's worth paying.
The irony is, this reluctance to jeopardize transatlantic relations was very similar to the reluctance Britain felt towards confronting the other rising power of the age, Nazi Germany.
I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
This is now regarded as a shameful policy of appeasement, a policy that has been roundly criticized ever since. Yet despite Britain's reluctance, the world was changing and events were moving beyond her control.
Today we rule Germany, tomorrow the world. What kind of talk was that?
Far-sighted politicians on both sides of the Atlantic began to recognize what was going on and act accordingly.
Roosevelt would not subscribe to War Plan Red. He was not one who could see a war between Britain and the United States as occurring. Quite the reverse. He wanted a strong Britain. He wanted a Britain led by leaders who would be willing to stand up to the Nazi challenge, because he understood that a strong Britain was also a good defense for the United States. That Britain and the United States had a common enemy in Nazi Germany. And Roosevelt and Churchill both understood this long before their publics understood that danger.
In the days to come, the British and American people will, for their own safety and for the good of all, work together in majesty, in justice, and in peace.
And with that, the special relationship was born. With hindsight, it seems incredible the two could ever have planned for war against one another. So what significance did Plan Red actually have?
I think the lesson for today from War Plan Red is the way that in the context of your era, you become a kind of paranoiac, imagining enemies and preparing for wars that are based on your imagination.
You can imagine how these things come about. War planners have to plan for war. They have to plan for the worst possible scenarios. So you follow the logic of it, and the logic of it says, well, we've got to invade Canada, we've got to terrorize civilians by bombing them, we've got to use poisonous gas, and so on and so forth. And none of this is supposed to get into the public domain because it's just the logic of war planning.
So I think the lesson of War Plan Red is that military planning can become insane on one hand, and it becomes a bad habit on the other. And neither are realistic for our real threats to the nation's security.
Plan Red was, in my opinion, a realistic set of contingency plans drawn up by the Americans for a war that they had to take seriously. But they didn't do it in a way that was unrealistic. I think that's a good recognition or good realization on their part that the threat is very serious, but the likelihood of that threat actually developing is relatively remote.
It is easy to dismiss the plans as fanciful, but from the perspective of the 1930s, they were a very sensible precaution. Plan Red marks the point where one great empire faded as the next grew daily in power and stature. Almost uniquely, the transition took place without a major war breaking out between the two nations. But it was perfectly reasonable for America to imagine it could have gone either way. In the end, there was no need for an American war with Britain, because they won anyway.
2, 3, 2.
The 20th century became the American century, as the United States took its place as the most powerful nation on Earth. Let us hope it is as painless the next time the baton is passed. And Plan Red itself? It was to meet an ignominious end.
It's 1939, June 15th, the Joint Board to the Secretary of War. Subject, Joint Army and Navy Basic War Plan Red. 1. A restudy of the current Joint Army and Navy Basic War Plan Red shows that plan to be wholly inapplicable to present conditions. Whew. I guess we're canceling this war. We can put away the poison gas. 2. The Joint Board recommends that while no further war planning be done under this plan, it be retained in its present condition until such time as another joint war plan requiring a major effort in the Atlantic becomes available.